Japan can be described as a country that starts slow but speeds up fast. Its territory only emerged from the Stone Age in the 3rd century BCE. That's when Rome was battling Carthage. Alexander the Great's empire had already fallen apart, and the Sarmatians with their heavy cavalry were replacing the Scythians in the steppes of Eastern Europe. And even though for much of the Middle Ages, the inhabitants of Japan's islands borrowed advancements from mainland Asia, they found themselves in a stronger position when the modern era rolled around. However, Japan's biggest triumph and moment in the spotlight came in the latter half of the 20th century, when it managed to dominate the US automobile market and others as well. This sparked curiosity among Americans, which Hollywood quickly turned into profit. Dozens of hastily made films about Japanese culture and history were released, often blending folklore and the wild imagination of screenwriters. Unsurprisingly, many of these focused on the supposed mystical qualities of Japanese blades. The roots of this fascination lie in Japanese Shintoism, where bladed weapons are key symbols. In fact, Japanese myths tie the very origin of their history to the first emperor, Jimmu, who wielded a divine sword. Quick side note. There's a separate video on this channel that dives into what Japanese single-edged bladed weapons really are. Here, we'll use the term sword in its European sense. That term has stuck historically, even though it might be more accurate to use saber or nihanto. Broadly, Japanese blades can be divided into 3 main categories. The first includes tanto and wakizashi, short blades. However, due to its larger handle, the wakizashi can sometimes rival European long blades in overall size. The second category includes katana and tachi. These had blade lengths reaching up to 90 centimeters, and while they featured handles suited for two-handed grips, their overall dimensions are closer to European hand-and-a-half swords. But the Japanese also had truly two-handed swords. These fall under the broad category of ōdachi, great swords, with a variant called ōdachi, or field sword. The blade of such weapons started at 91 centimeters and could easily reach 1.5 meters or more, with handles sometimes around half a meter long. In terms of sheer size, ōdachi rivaled European greatswords, and interestingly enough, they appeared around the same time, roughly the 14th century. That said, similar weapons were used by the Chinese as early as the 10th century. Take the massive zhanmadao, or horse-cutting sword, in literal translation. Fun fact, an online translator once rendered this as the horse chopping with a saber. Alternative researchers take note. Since China is located on the largest continent and borders vast steppes, dealing with cavalry was a constant concern. Zhanmadao served as a conversation starter with mounted enemies, more specifically, their horses. This is evident not only from the name but also from written sources, such as the Song military manuals. Infantry armed with these massive swords would form loose formations in front of the main force. Their task? Chop the legs of approaching enemy horses, a job that likely required a lot of nerve. Functionally, such blades were a more complex-to-produce alternative to polearms like the glaive or bardiche. It seems the Japanese used ōdachi in much the same way the Chinese employed zhanmadao, though there's a 16th century illustration showing a samurai on horseback wielding a massive sword. This was likely either an exception to the rule or just artistic license. Written sources such as the Tale of the Heike confirm that these weapons were primarily for infantry. In the 14th century, Japan experienced a war between two dynasties. The elite split into opposing factions, leading to frequent military clashes. At the same time, advancements in agriculture allowed for 2 harvests per year. Around market hubs, towns of skilled craftsmen and traders began to emerge. In short, despite the turbulent times, progress marched on, likely enabling the creation of truly massive swords. Forging such blades was no easy task, and crafting a sword nearly as tall as a Japanese person, or sometimes taller, represented the pinnacle of a blacksmith's skill. It's worth noting that even in the 16th century, blades from the famed Muramasa swordsmith dynasty contained 50 to 100 times more slag than modern steel, and the bigger the blade, the greater the stress it endured during strikes. Interestingly, the thickness of large ōdachi and ōdachi blades was often the same as the shorter tachi, about 5 to 6 millimeters. So what you end up with is a massive sword with a relatively thin blade, and its curvature, due to its size, was even greater than that of the tachi or katana. The piercing capabilities of such a design weren't the best. Many might disagree, but you could argue that a European sword with its developed guard and straight double-edged blade, is a more versatile weapon. However, every form has its strengths and weaknesses. When it comes to the ōdachi, its long blade combined with a curve provides excellent cutting properties, though it's tough to utilize them against an opponent in metal armor. But when facing an inadequately protected body, we're not just talking about inflicting wounds, it's about literally slicing someone in half. It's also worth noting that in open spaces, the ōdachi's size gives an advantage against opponents wielding shorter weapons and allows for more confident action against multiple attackers while maintaining distance. This massive weapon was carried on the back, but its size made it hard to draw quickly. Still, it's more of a military tool that needed to be readied right before battle. Overall, the philosophy of Japanese bladed weapons revolves around delivering unexpected, quick strikes, and the ōdachi somewhat deviates from this norm. Rather, it serves as a specific tool for the battlefield. This is indirectly supported by the fact that by the 17th century, as major battles concluded, it began to vanish. Additionally, since the Japanese were known for enacting unique laws that sometimes prohibited carrying weapons or imposed restrictions on their length, only a few large swords have survived to this day. It's important to note that the typical combat ōdachi usually exceeded 1.5 meters in length, but there's plenty of information online about truly gigantic examples. Take, for instance, the ōdachi Norimitsu, which measures 3 meters and 77 centimeters in total length, with a maximum blade thickness of over 2 centimeters and weighing 14.5 kilograms, crafted in the mid-15th century. We even know the name of the smith and the purpose behind creating such a monster. As I mentioned earlier, the sword is one of the main symbols of Shintoism, representing the mystical power that spirits can bestow upon humans or something along those lines. That's why swords were often found near temples, serving as sacred objects. Making an offering to a temple meant making a tribute to higher beings. So presenting a giant sword as a gift to a temple, and by extension to the deities, especially before an important battle, was quite common. For smiths, such a gift was an opportunity to showcase their skills, or simply put, advertise their work. In fact, most of the ōdachi that have survived to this day were originally made for temples as decorative elements and have been preserved as relics. By the way, here we see a certain parallel with Europe, where two-handed swords at the turn of the Middle Ages and the early modern period grew in size and became more ceremonial, parade weapons. Something tells me that even the functional ōdachi swords were teetering on the edge of practicality. Clashing blade to blade with a long, curved, and often rather thin sword, like you'd see in theatrical fencing, is far from ideal. At the same time, this isn't the kind of weapon you can quickly draw and use for a flurry of lightning-fast strikes. In my opinion, the ōdachi was primarily a tool for dealing with horses. Considering that medieval Asian horses were typically quite short at the withers, it's plausible that soldiers targeted not the legs, dense bones that could damage the blade, but rather the softer neck, which was often roughly at the shoulder height of an infantryman. Unfortunately, medieval chroniclers weren't exactly keen on detailing the finer points of bladed weapons and their use. So, when it comes to many aspects of this, much of this remains educated guesswork.